Alrighty, everyone. I have here attorney Jeff Wittenbrink, who I reached out to. I heard him on InfoWars about the State versus Spell case. It's a Louisiana State Supreme Court case, and I'm going to let him take it from the top. We'll be discussing the significance of this case, and then after that, the implications. So if you don't mind, sir, if you want to tell us how it all got started and just the beginnings of this.
Okay, so it's back in March of 2020.
Mm-hmm.
The March 13th was Friday the 13th. The president declared emergency over the COVID-19 pandemic, and so immediately other state actors, other governors in the country started issuing emergency orders, and there were two more emergency orders issued by Governor John Bel Edwards with regard to the early days of the pandemic. With regard to how many people could meet in gatherings. Okay. And so the first order, JBE 30/2020, said that you could not have more than 50 people that were going to be together in one place. Then the second order, JBE 33/2020, said no more than 10 people were going to be allowed in one place. And the problem with the orders, Zan, was that they had exceptions for a lot of different things. And so this was supposed to be a public health measure. The governor had declared an emergency because of the pandemic. And so these were public health orders. It was a public health emergency that was declared under Title 29 of the Louisiana Revised Statutes. So when he declared the emergency, he made these orders, and the exceptions that were carved out were for airports, office buildings, shopping malls, at least the initial order, all kinds of places where people actually could gather, did not have a numerical limitation, and could be together in close contact for a significant period of time. There's nothing prohibiting that in the actual order itself. And so when that happened, of course, Pastor Spell, whom I represent, did not want to be limited when these other things were going on. In other words, he looked and said, well, right down the road, there's a Walmart, and it's wide open. There are people in there elbow to elbow all day, going in, picking things up, putting things down, touching things, whatever. And I don't know if you ever go to Walmart, but if you go to Walmart on a Saturday morning, you could stand in line for 45 minutes, no problem.
At least.
And you're going to be, back then they had very loose, in fact, no real regulation about social distancing except for a suggestion of it. No mask order was in place. And so these places were all just as much places where you could, if the goal was to stop the spread of disease, and it was bad and contagious as they were saying, then certainly these places shouldn't be wide open when you would close the church. Of course, the church has the protection of the First Amendment, and the other places don't. I mean, the fact of the matter is you don't have a constitutional right to shop at Walmart. You do have a constitutional right to practice your religion. So from the very beginning, Pastor Spell said, listen, I'm going to go ahead and hold church. Now, initially, they really did they took temperatures at the door. They used hand sanitizer. They were sitting families, at least unless you're from the same household, you were sitting at least 6 feet apart. And they had room because there were a lot of people that were frightened at the beginning of the pandemic, didn't want to come to church. But he was not going to close and tell people that they couldn't come. Now, the governor sent several emissaries who, first, sort of asked Pastor Spell politely not to hold church, and then more threateningly, and finally, at the end of March of 2020, Central Police Chief Roger Corcoran issued 6 citations to Pastor Spell, saying you violated the governor's orders, and these are your citations. And so technically, that is an arrest, right? You get issued a summons and citation. And then Chief Roger Corcoran from the Central City Police went on TV and said, Pastor Tony Spell has been arrested, and explained to the public, that he's been arrested for gathering outside the parameters of the governor's orders. So anyway, that was broadcast right away. Pastor Spell, continued. He was going to hold church. Now, under the regular statute, the only power that they had was to issue these citations. But they started watching him in 24-hour surveillance, cameras put up on utility poles right on near his property, and then a camera across the street, a large commercial type camera put up across the street at a private residence aimed right straight at the front door of the church. So they're monitoring him. They had cars following him. They had police surveillance in a park, which was right across the street, that would park there and watch his house. So we had all this surveillance, and finally they caught on video what they thought was another offense, and then arrested him for that offense through the surveillance, you see, and made as a condition of his bond that he had to obey the governor's orders. So because of that, he was told he was going to have to obey the governor's orders as a condition of bond. When he did not do that, then he was arrested again and taken to parish prison, let him out on bond, put a ankle bracelet on him, said you can't preach in church. Anyway, so we filed a lawsuit in federal district court to stop this harassment from going on. And immediately, within a day of us filing the lawsuit or serving the governor with the lawsuit, the governor's orders changed. Different limitations were put in place. And so our first injunction that we filed for in civil district court was denied as being moot because the order that we filed under had changed. And we took that all the way up. I was contacted by Judge Roy Moore. I don't know if you know Judge Roy Moore.
You mentioned he was in
Supreme Court Justice of the Supreme Court of Alabama. And fairly significant figure, taking a strong stand for religious liberty. He has a foundation called the Foundation for Moral Law. Excellent group of men. Anyway, they contacted me because they knew a person down here, Judge Darrell White, who had recommended that they call me. So I found myself on the phone with Judge Roy Moore, who asked me to help his local counsel because they needed local counsel for Pastor Spell. So we started with that federal case, and then I took on the defense of the criminal case. So that's where basically all of it started.
Okay, so that's the beginning. So just recently, I've seen what was released by Justice Crain, who seems to be in your favor. There was a 5-7 decision, and he wrote a pretty thorough statement saying we don't want, saying that he just wanted equal treatment, not special treatment. And I thought that was pretty interesting because it's basically pointing out the hypocrisy, just equal treatment of, like you mentioned earlier in so many words, Walmart is able to sell goods and people can cluster or gather, whatever terminology, if you will, not far from him. But if he wants to do a stated in the Constitution First Amendment right, he's not allowed. And then what kills me is how the government kind of wants to juke you whenever it's time to file suit. They want you all of a sudden adjust it to, try and steal your thunder, saying it's a moot point. And so it seems like y'all are being targeted.
Well, certainly Pastor Spell felt targeted. Again, several prominent individuals were sent out to sort of warn him not to do what he was doing. And the biggest problem, I think, for the government was that he was very vocal about his dissent. I want to tell you a story about Pastor Spell. So I went to visit him there when all this was going on. And he introduced me to a man who had been to church in the previous year, who had stage 4 cancer.
Yes.
And this man never missed a service. He was there every time the doors were opened. He would go and pray and worship and be with the congregation. Now, this man, his immune system was gone, during this period of time because he was on chemo, he had cancer, he could have caught a cold and died. But he wanted to be there in church. It was important to him to go and worship God. And Pastor Spell looked at me after introducing me and telling me this man's story. He said, now, what do I tell this man if I'm going to close my church because someone might get sick? One important point that's overlooked by a lot of people is that this is not a mandatory thing. No one forces anyone to go to church, including Pastor Spell. Nobody's required to go to church. You go to church as a voluntary exercise, and for the people to whom it's important, it's very important. And so, the governor made all these exceptions for, quote, essential businesses. One of the Supreme Court justices, I think it was Justice Gorsuch, of the United States Supreme Court, said, basically they're saying that some activities are more essential than others.
Yes.
And they did not include the free exercise of religion, which many people consider to be essential. And so, but Pastor Spell put it pretty plainly in that, in that introduction. What do I tell this fellow who's been willing to come, risking his life to come, because he wants to be there and worship God? How do I tell him he's, not able to do that because somebody might get sick? So I thought it was very good. It just pointed up the sincerity of the pastor. He's been really pilloried in the press as being uncaring, as not caring if he kills people. He just wants to make money, et cetera, et cetera. His congregation is mostly made up of people that can't even afford really to go to church. They don't have transportation. He has 39 buses that he sends out to pick up people that don't have vehicles or transportation to get to church, people from poor neighborhoods, inner city neighborhoods. The church is probably the most diverse church around, anywhere around, certainly in this area. And I think he said 26 or 27 nationalities, lots and lots of African Americans, very good mix of folks. But he goes out and gets people to church, feeds them a meal, and then takes them back home. So, if it was about money, those people wouldn't be coming to his church, right? He'd be bringing just people that could afford to come and pay a tithe.
Yes.
But instead, I think, I don't know what he told me, that just the diesel bill alone every week is, 39 buses, you can figure it out.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. It's a lot of money that he spends bringing in people that couldn't otherwise get there. So he's very sincere in his beliefs. He's very sincere in preaching the gospel to those folks and giving them some relief in their lives. And, tons of stories about people that he's taken in, people that had drug addictions, people that had, criminal problems, literally taught them a trade, through the church, put them back to work, giving them a reason to get up in the morning. And he does a lot of good work. So
Yes,
I'm very proud to represent him for the person that he is.
Yes, sir. Yeah. Well, it seems to me that this legislation, it makes everyone suspect.
Well, the first thing you have to know is it's not really legislation. Legislation has to be debated.
Oh, yeah, you're right.
These were orders that were basically decrees.
Yes.
They come down from the government.
Yes.
And that was one of the things that we argued before the Supreme Court, is that, listen, these, unlike a regular statute, these don't get the benefit of a presumption of constitutionality. A normal statute passed by the legislature, you have a criminal statute, you've got to presume that it's constitutional, and you have to prove, proof is on the defendant to prove that it's unconstitutional. What the Supreme Court said in this case is, no, burden of proof is going to be on the DA for these particular executive orders to prove their constitutionality. And they didn't do it. So.
Wow. Okay. Yes. Okay. And also, too, another issue that this raises is it puts the government in between people not being able to make the decision. In so many words, we have to check with the government to see what we can do, where we can go, what's okay, what this new terminology of what's considered essential. And that's something that to me is just so un-American. And people should be left to have the right to discern. It assumes that we can't discern. They have to act as our shepherd, if you will. And I'm not trying to make some sort of religious analogy, but whenever we hear, this is just a random hypo, the drunk babble of a homeless guy under a bridge saying something crazy, we know that we don't need the government. We don't need John Bell to have an executive order or whatever it may be to come and say, hey, we can't listen to this is disinformation, or this is not essential, or that, us as civilized people with just common sense know that, and that was just one analogy, but someone who is inebriated, if you will, that the things that they could be saying, are not that factual or true, or could be exaggerated. What hurts me and why I take this personal is because it's left up to the government to decide. It's government discernment, what you can do, where you can go, and it sets a trend. And I think that this left unchecked, these kinds of actions by Governor Edwards left unchecked will further influence other people that are looking to be, and these are my words, petty tyrants. And it is very hard once we give up these freedoms and we acquiesce to this to turn the tide back and have this pendulum swing back in a more, liberal.
It was really amazing during the pandemic how much the public went along with it.
I was shocked too. That's why I ran.
The media, I think, was complicit in that. People were so frightened by the pandemic, so frightened that we did things that we've not done before as a country. We've never had a general sort of lockdown of commerce and the economy and everything else in order to stop the spread of the disease. We've never, and here's one reason I think that that's true, Zan, is that, in the past, when you had a deadly disease, people are not stupid. They would take their own precautions, right? So if this were like Ebola, for example, but it was communicable, a respiratory virus, but had a hemorrhagic fever and you would bleed out and die, okay? That's a nightmare scenario. You wouldn't have to tell people to be careful.
No.
You would have to tell people to stay out of public areas. You would have people hiding in their homes and getting food and provisions the best way they could with minimal contact, right? So that's the kind of scenario where you could sleep, you wouldn't even, number one, you wouldn't need the government mandates because people would be doing it of their own accord. And then the government could step in and protect some people that were sick or quarantine households. We've not quarantined well people in the past in our country. You isolate the people that are sick. You protect the people that are vulnerable, not lock down the entire society. So people really went along with this stuff. And for a long time. And one of the reasons they did, of course, were all the economic measures that were undertaken by the government. They were giving out these PPP loans,
yes,
which were actually not loans, but grants. And it was just free money. And in fact, Governor Edwards actually got on television at one point and said, listen, we shut down the emergency. We quit getting emergency money. And so the Federal Stafford Act, which is meant to help in emergencies for the emergencies and for things that are needed in emergencies. We have a hurricane, for example. Stafford Act money pays for cleanup, pays for repairs, pays for extra police and fire duty. Those are the kinds of things that are paid for. Well, this pandemic emergency, Louisiana has a $2 billion surplus. Now, when has that happened in Louisiana? We have balanced the budget for 3 years running on federal emergency funds. That's the reason this thing has lasted as long as it has, frankly. The spread of money, they basically sort of sweetening the pot for people to stay home, these extra funds that they gave out. Of course, it really destroyed, many small businesses, things that are not going to come back. One of my favorite restaurants here in town, Rama, they're gone. You never come back. I know there's plenty of others, but
that's a shame. Yeah, that's a microcosm of what's going on.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. Okay. And, I just think that it was a huge exercise of control, and we have to think about what we're giving up for what we're getting in return. And it's just, like you mentioned, it's going to wipe out things like this, issues like this, wipe out small businesses. And I am very proud, I speak for myself, of Pastor Spell for going through this. That way, he, is laying down the barbed wire fence, so to speak, if you'll entertain this analogy, to pave the way for other people and give them courage and try and blaze the trail for the minutia of having some sort of legal precedent that if this stunt, if you will, again, my words, is pulled again by a governor, that it'll be easier to keep them in check. And
the Supreme Court did a really good job in this opinion of giving teeth to the Constitution. So many times you feel like that government gets away with, quote unquote, doing things that override constitutional rights. And so they really did stand up in this instance and say, no, you can go this far and no further. And you can't favor secular businesses and disfavor religion. You have to abide by the Constitution. They used the words from the Louisiana Constitution that said the state has a duty to preserve those rights inviolate, which is very strong language. And so it was very, very encouraging to see some independence and some courage from our Louisiana Supreme Court. And I just think the justices did an excellent job of analysis. The opinion itself is strong as a garlic milkshake. It is really strong.
All you need is one clove, yes. I'm trying to.
It was really, really well written, and we're just really pleased at the way that it turned out. I'm proud of Pastor Spell for standing up. You can't have a great case without a client, right? Yes. So no matter how correct I might think that I was about this case, if he had said, let's just settle, let's just go ahead, I'll take a plea, we'll just, get this behind us and move on.
It wouldn't have been fully digested, though. I'm so glad.
It would have been horrible. Yeah, it would have been a terrible.
It's that fleshing out.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah. And now you mentioned before we started this interview that there's something coming up again, or there's some sort of what lies ahead.
We're still within the rehearing period. They could
the
district attorney can still file to ask the Supreme Court to rehear the case. I think that's very difficult. I think that it would be very difficult to get the Supreme Court to rehear the arguments. It was a 5-2 decision. Justice Weimer did make his points about what evidence is required. I think the DA may be concerned that there could be some impact on other motions to quash, not necessarily with regard to the constitutional issues in this case, but just the procedural aspects. So they may have some concerns about that. I don't know that this is the case to try to rehear to make that point. I think they'd probably be better off to just wait until it actually raises its head in another case and take that up. So.
Yes, sir. And should this not be reheard, it'll be set in stone. Am I correct?
Yeah. The Louisiana Supreme Court is the final arbiter of state law.
Yeah.
So they would have to be overturned somehow. And when they're talking about the Constitution, it's not going to be overturned for a while.
No, and also what's nice is your firm, your practice, of course, with your client, or if this doesn't get reheard, best case scenario, just it lies as is. It is a precedent, it's a legal precedent that's been fleshed out that other states could adopt.
Well, certainly,
or other businesses could adopt that.
Certainly other states could look at the language of this opinion. And again, the analysis was very solid. He did a good job. He relied on some Supreme Court precedents that weren't actually cases on the merits. And so this is it's a very good opinion. Could have a big influence.
Yes. I sincerely appreciate it.
So it's going to distinguish us from places like Canada, where they still have pastors in jail.
That's a shame. Yes. So you're abreast, obviously, if you're volunteering what's going on over there. The Polish pastor.
Right.
Yeah. It's such a shame.
Well, it's horrible. And the poor Canadian truckers. Some of them were asking about their First Amendment rights. Of course, they don't have First Amendment rights. That's a uniquely American thing. And so. Yes, they have their charter, but their charter says that the government only has to do what is reasonable.
which is
And,
open-ended interpretation.
Sure,
They can.
it gives a lot of leeway. If it was, and in fact, in truth and in fact, if it was just the Supreme Court of Louisiana made the point of saying, look, these burdens on your First Amendment rights, they have to survive strict scrutiny, which is the highest level of scrutiny by the court. If it was just a reasonableness standard, we could very well have lost. Certainly the governor could say, well, this was the only thing we could do that was reasonable during the time. And if they got away with that, well, then there really would be no protection at all. And that's what they're facing in Canada. They don't have our same law.
No, I'm picking up what you're laying down. And what's a shame also too, that, and this is another story for another day, but I do want to hint at the fact that Trudeau is a World Economic Young Global Leader graduate. So is Gates and Angela Merkel and a couple other people. So something to think about. But in conclusion, is there anything else you'd like to volunteer or let the audience know, or talk about yourself, or
well, I'm just
sum up this case?
been proud to be a part of the legal team with Justice Weimer from the Alabama Supreme Court, Talmadge Butts, who's an associate there, Joe Eismo, Colonel Joe Eismo, all the fellows at the Foundation for Moral Law. I think they're doing great work, and really honored that they chose me to help them in this case, and that I was able to help Pastor Spell. I think Pastor Spell is a fine man, a courageous pastor, and really glad that it worked out the way it did.
I am too. That's why I'm here today. Well, thank you so much, and I'll end it here. Oh, man.